It's great to see people here from what I'm sure are different parts of the world, different time zones, joining together with us to discuss connecting climate change, disasters and sustainable development. My name's Tristan McCowan. I'm chairing this webinar today. I'm Professor of International Education at University College London Institute of Education and also Principal Investigator of the Transforming Universities for a Changing Climate research project. And this webinar is part of the research project in question. So I'll start by just saying a few words about the project before introducing our speakers for today and saying a little bit about the structure of the session and questions and so forth. And just to let everybody know that we will be recording this session as well. So Transforming Universities for a Changing Climate, or Climate U as we call it for short, is a 3-year project started last year, so it'll run until 2023. It's a Global Challenges Research Fund project involving University College London with universities in Kenya, Mozambique, Fiji and Brazil, focusing on 2 main areas. Firstly, strengthening the impact of universities through the diverse forms of their work, whether education, research and community engagement, on their local communities and on the countries in which they're located, but also generating a deeper understanding of the role that universities play, this multifaceted role in addressing the broader challenges of climate change. And a very important aspect of that is the topic that we're going to look at today, the relationship between climate change and other similar areas which bring together the human world and the non-human natural world, and the interactions between different parts of the natural environment and social challenges. So it's a huge pleasure to present today this paper. It's a working paper which is now available on our website. Shortly, we will put through in the chat the website for our project and the place where you can find the working paper if you haven't had it already. It's authored by Kaori Kitagawa, who is one of our co-investigators for the project. And this is the second working paper. It's also the second webinar. We're organizing these public webinars to accompany the publication of these working papers to generate some public debate and discussion. So our main speaker for today is Dr. Kaori Kitagawa, who's Associate Professor at University College London in the Department of Education, Practice and Society. She works broadly in the field of international and comparative education, with particular emphasis on disaster preparedness and education, public pedagogy and lifelong learning, and has been bringing many of those areas to enrich the Climate U project to date. So we're very pleased to welcome her here today to make the presentation on this paper. And we're very privileged to have Professor Tercio Ambrizzi as our respondent today. Professor in the Institute of Astronomy, Geophysics and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Sao Paulo, has a very important role as an academic in debates around climate change through his meteorological work, but also has various roles within his institution where he's grappling with these issues on a day-to-day basis as Director of Sustainability Coordinator for the Interdisciplinary Climate Investigation Center. So many connections with this work, and we're really delighted that he could join us today to respond to the ideas in this working paper and to open up questions for debate. And we're really looking forward to the participation of the other attendees today, as much as is possible in this kind of format. So we would invite you at any stage in the course of the presentation and response to put forward questions and comments in the chat function. So you can put these forward in writing, or you can simply signal to me that you would like to ask a question. When it comes to that part, we have plenty of time for discussion in the second half of the webinar. When it comes to that time, I will invite you to make your question orally if the technology supports us, or you can leave it as a written question and I will read it out. That's completely up to you. You can also raise your hand using the raise hand function, and then I will ask people in order to ask their questions or make their comments. And please feel free to either ask a direct question about the paper of the author, or a general question, and we hope that Professor Terzo will also be involved in that discussion. Or please feel free to make a general comment, which we can have as part of the debate. I'd like to thank also Raki Kabawala and Charlie Nussi also for supporting the setup of this event and its management. So thank you very much, both of them, for their input. So without further ado, I will hand over now to Kaori for the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tristan, for your kind introduction, and thank you for organizing the webinar. And thank you for the audience from all over the world. I really appreciate it. I'm going to share the slides now, and let me know if you can see it. We tested it and it worked earlier. Is it okay?
We can see that fine, thanks.
Thank you, Charlie. Right. So I would like to follow the structure of the paper for today's talk, and the paper is there, the link is there for those if you haven't seen it yet. The motivation behind this paper, writing this paper, was for my own learning, actually, to have an understanding of this topic of connectedness and disconnectedness, and also to reinforce the advantages of connecting those three areas. Therefore, the paper wasn't a paper didn't present any new findings. It was a synthesis of existing arguments. And my focus was mainly to look at the landmark reports to identify the key positions of each area. I would like to go through this very quickly, probably assuming that colleagues are very familiar. So the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction offers guidance for the area of disaster risk reduction. And it has a very clear definition of what disaster risk reduction is. And as you can see, there is a very clear link to sustainable development. Risks encompass all types of disasters and disaster risks, including the one we are currently experiencing, which is the pandemic. I also want to mention that this disaster risk reduction is the policy objective of disaster risk management, and I'll be using both terms. And currently the guiding policy document is called the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, introduced in 2015. Climate change is governed by the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. And there is a convention of parties that is the supreme governing body of climate change agenda. And there's an annually meeting, and we just missed one last year, supposed to happen in Glasgow, which was postponed due to the pandemic. And climate change has two dimensions, mitigation and adaptation. And I'll be talking both, but mainly probably more focused on the latter. And the Paris Agreement, that is the document of the around climate change agenda. Whereas sustainable development is a very broad concept, and that is defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations. And it has this tripartite notion supported by the economy, environment, and society, and that comprise this conception of sustainable development. And we have the SDGs, and which was endorsed in the Transforming Our World document, in again issued in 2015. So in 2015, we had these three major agreements, international agreements. Moving on to disconnectedness. What do we mean by disconnectedness? It's always helpful to look at actual examples. So these are in the paper, but I thought I could highlight them to share with you so that we have clear understanding of what exactly we mean by disconnectedness. So as measures for tropical cyclones, for example, installing heavy roofs were taken as an engineering solution, which actually does reduce building vulnerability, but at the same time, if there is an earthquake, that can cause demolition of the building, like it did in many earthquake situations, including the one in the 1995 Kobe earthquake. Another example could be prioritizing economic growth. In many places, mangroves have been removed and properties were developed. But such projects can undermine environmental protection and hazard mitigation, leading to increased vulnerability and exposure of the communities. And such projects may raise greenhouse gas emissions as well, and also increasing disaster risks. So let's unpack this disconnectedness, and I can identify 5 aspects of this, but there could be more. And let's look at one by one. The first one is the separation of historical developments in these 3 areas. That seems obvious, but let me explain a little bit more. Sustainable development was probably came to be discussed in depth in the 70s, although the term itself wasn't necessarily used. But it was in the 1987, this Brundtland report, Our Common Future, in which that tripartite framework of the economy, environment, and society conception of sustainable development was clarified. And the disaster risk reduction, and my apologies for this bad image, it's REES, Yokohama Strategy and Plan of Action for a Safer World, which was issued in 1994. And up to 70s disaster risk or back then disaster management was, the focus of it was mainly engineering solutions, building dams and levees. But the vulnerability approach was a paradigm shift. And this was addressed in this document, Yokohama Strategy. Therefore, because this recognition of the human side of vulnerability, that has made a link with development and sustainability issues. Now, climate change has become a global agenda really in after 2000. And in the COP 11 meeting in 2000, in which in addition to climate change mitigation, the importance of climate change adaptation was emphasized. And this is the report by IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That they do science of climate change. They issued this report in 2012, and it included acknowledgement of the need for linking climate change and climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction for sustainable development. So because of these different developments, historical context, they do use certain key terminologies slightly differently, particularly in disaster risk reduction and climate change fields, and particularly the concept of vulnerability has been really debated. As I said earlier, in disaster risk reduction, the human side, human approaches, social approaches to vulnerability has been around, while in the area of climate change, it wasn't the case. And the definition has expanded, and as you can see in the 2014 version of IPCC definition, but still many authors do argue that their approach is hazard-centric, focusing on science of climate change rather than human side of hazard. This leads to the next point of climate change as a scapegoat. And this is a very political point. And I think this Barack Obama's quote explains everything. It goes, "No challenge poses a greater threat to future generations than climate change." Basically what he's saying is climate change is the biggest challenge in the humanity. And this kind of perspective actually disconnects from the debates around disaster and development. Next one is the methodological differences, and often the framework proposed by Lee in 1993, scale mismatch framework, is used, and there are three aspects in this framework. The first, spatial scale mismatch, refers to disaster risk reduction being micro, bottom-up, and community-based approaches, measures, while climate change tends to be macro, top-down. And that poses a challenge for localizing climate change adaptation measures. And the second, temporal scale mismatch, refers to some disaster risk reduction interventions tend to be short-term, particularly in the response and reconstruction phases. Many donors aim for quick fix and short-term intervention solutions. And this also relates to the political cycle of the government, the country as well, because politicians want to have solutions quickly. And the third scale mismatch is functional, and that refers to the differences in traditions and political loyalties of the leading bodies, which results in vertical administration structure. And this, the functional scale mismatch, is actually about causing artificial separations in international agreements. And what this means is, because of the too much excessive emphasis on climate change, as if it is the only hazard influencer. And the motivation behind this is there's a political will to regress to a hazard-centric viewpoint, thereby downplaying the political root causes of disaster vulnerability, as Gelman says. So moving on to a much more hopefully positive connectedness. And again, let's look at practical examples. Staying on the case of mangroves, so this is the opposite case of the previous scenario. If we could grow and preserve the mangroves, then that would help hazard mitigation and serving as a breeding ground for the communities. Another example could be if local knowledge is utilized to change crops and extending growing season, responding to changing climate, then that could secure, that could enhance food security and reduce disaster risk. So some authors summarize what benefits of connectedness could be. Largely, there are three areas. One, obviously cost-effective financial management, because they are merging three areas. Secondly, sharing knowledge and experience enhance the decision-making process and outcome. And thirdly, the conceptual clarity between these three areas could lead to integrated approaches. Again, unpacking connectedness, and there are four areas. Between disaster risk reduction and sustainable development, because of the reasons I explained earlier, a lot of authors have written about this topic. And there is a consensus that disasters are the costs of the failures in development. So there's a tight link there. However, in the field of climate change, even the climate change is not only changing, but becoming more extreme, affecting the frequency and severity of hazardous events, therefore interfering against sustainable development. Definitely there's the levels of vulnerability and exposure which have to be improved. DRR, including CCA, this is a phrase often used in the field of disaster risk reduction. And what it is they actually share common aims of vulnerability reduction, promotion of inclusiveness, and long-term disaster risk management. So why not? They should coordinate and collaborate approaches and involving diverse stakeholders. And therefore, it is totally legitimate and feasible to combine the two. But ultimately, these three fields actually share common objectives, which are reducing risks, protecting the environment, and promoting sustainability and development. And therefore, it is no longer possible to speak about disasters, development, and climate change in isolation of each other. It's totally natural thing and an obvious thing to pull these areas together. So some authors have proposed how can we move forward. For example, we have Professor Ilan Kelman today, so hopefully we can hear from him a lot more on this. So I just want to introduce his new framework of the connectedness here. And another suggestion is to how do we go about policy making and implementing them in different sectors. So these are concrete examples suggested by Begum et al. And also some have suggested utilizing the concept of resilience as an overarching goal, treating resilience as an outcome rather than an agenda. So to conclude, I would like to share with you my favorite quotes, which I found during my research for this paper. First one is by Lee in 1993. Scale mismatches were the product of politics as much as of science. Guess what? 30 years down the line, I think we're still in the same position. Nothing has changed. The next one, climate change offers a convenient contemporary catch-all as the source of disasters, by Kilman and Gaylord in 2010. This refers to climate change being a scapegoat and too much emphasis being put on to the climate change agenda. So what do we need to do is to look at vulnerability issues, which are poverty, inequality, rural and urban livelihoods, poor development, poor governance, demographic change, urbanization, biodiversity. All of these are the root causes of vulnerability. Therefore, we need to shift from hazard-centric approaches to human-centric approaches. Thank you very much. I'll stop it here. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to our discussion and your feedback.
Thank you very much, Kauri, for that very engaging talk and for raising those issues so clearly and vividly. And I think opening up, not only introducing those ideas, but also opening up some fascinating questions for discussion in an area that I'm sure you'll agree is absolutely crucial to, as a global community, responding to these challenges, how we link or alternatively don't link together these different areas. So thank you very much for that, Kauri. We'll move on now to Professor Tercio, who will provide a response. And just to repeat for those participants there, do at any stage in the chat function, do put forward any questions or comments that you'd like to ask. Thank you. I will move on now to Tercio.
Thank you very much, Dr. Professor Tristan and Professor Kauri. Thank you for the invitation and to be here and also to participate of the Climate EU project. Let me start saying that congratulations to Dr. Kauri for not only for the paper produced, but also for the presentation. Very clear, very nice to hear these discussions about the connections between the sustainable development and risk reduction and also climate change. And I'm going straight forward to the framework proposed by Kelman 2017, as you just presented, which suggests that sustainable development involves the climate change. And we see that climate change, we have the mitigation, what you call it, the pollution prevention, and also the adaptation, which is actually the disaster risk reduction. They are really linked to each other. So clearly indicates that there is a strong link between the GRR, CC, and SD. You know? I think there is no discussion about that, in fact. In fact, indirectly, the global society always knew that exists, mostly because of the media and the impact that most vulnerable people are suffering with climate and weather extreme events. Of course, blaming the climate change for all natural disasters that occur is the easiest way to justify inaction and the non-recognition of its importance. While positive trends in rainfall streams, for instance, represent hazards, they do not constitute a disaster itself. However, if this hazard impacts population living in vulnerable areas, they constitute a disaster. An increase in extreme rain events is accompanied by an appropriate occupation of vulnerable areas, such as slopes, banks of watercourses. This increases the risk of inundation, flooding, and landslides. But perhaps the question we should ask to ourselves is how we can educate the institutions and governments that GRR, CC, and SD need to be treated as a unique agenda where political difference and other motivations should be put aside. the another question is, are the science and scientists passing a clear information about this framework to all? I think that's what we should be discussing. And I would like to link that to one practical example. I believe the most important nowadays is what is happening in the big cities in the world. Well, the climate change community has concluded that human activities are changing the Earth's climate in ways that increase risk to cities. And this has been written in the last IPCC reports. Cities and their citizens already have begun to experience the effects of climate change. Changing climate has led to changes in weather and climate extremes. This can result in changes in heavy rainfall and dry spells of unprecedented magnitude. Anthropogenic changes have led to significant modifications in the weather system, and as a consequence, population is more exposed to natural disasters, such as floods, landslides, and the severe droughts, as I said before. This affects rural and mainly areas of high risk and vulnerability in human centers. An extreme rainfall event is not a natural disaster by itself. A disaster is triggered by hazards, which can be natural, geological, hydrometeorological, or biological, or induced by human process, environmental degradation, and technological hazards. Dr. Kaori has already mentioned that. Globally, the impacts of climate-related disasters are increasing. The impacts of climate-related disasters may be exacerbated in cities due to interaction of climate change with urbanization infrastructure systems, growing urbanization population, and economic activities. So climate change is expected not only to affect the intensity and the frequency of extreme events, but also to amplify existing society and environmental risks and create novel risks for cities. Understanding and anticipating these changes, you help cities prepare for a more sustainable future. This means making cities more resilient to climate-related disasters and managing long-term climate risks in ways that protect people and encourage prosperity. It also means improving cities' abilities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. As most of the world's population live in urban areas nowadays, cities require specific attention on risk reduction and resilient building. Another important point we should put in context here is that climate risks fall disproportionately on low-income groups who occupy high-risk cities. They have least adequate provision of protective infrastructure and services. Urban areas and mega cities in Latin America, for instance, are vulnerable to natural disasters, and climate change is expected to aggravate the situation. So it is recognized that over the last decade, hydrometeorological extremes have become more frequent and intense in most parts of the world, in Brazil in particular, with records of significant socioeconomic impacts and losses of human lives. This led to the need of strengthening of disaster risk management at local levels. Concerning this critical situation, not only in Brazil, but around the world, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, as Dr. Kaori has said, emphasize the urgency of natural plans implementation to effectively protect the population. In fact, we can actually think in terms of also a framework. On one side, we have the climate change adaptation, rising global temperature that will impact on the territories, severe events will be more frequently, adaptation of infrastructure for local adaptation is important. The other side is the environmental justice, because of the poorest suffer the most impacts. We will need institutional plans, policies, and strategies that is not yet included in the local residents. And together with that, we have the anticipatory governance. We have to have the capacity building plans, policies, instruments, scenarios, and technology actually to mitigate and help to adapt to the climate and at the same time to save lives. I think that it's quite clear that we cannot talk about climate change without involving the Sustainable Development Goals in all its spheres. Dr. Kaori in her papers point out some of this. For instance, the goals 13 that take urgent action to combat climate change and impacts, and some of the other targets, for instance, ensure sustainable food production systems and implement resilience agricultural practices, and also the substantial increase in number of cities and human settlements adopting the implementing integrated policy and plan towards mitigation adaptation, and the goal 7, that is ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. As you can see, that we have to convince the governments and the institutions, and Dr. Kaori has finished with the sentence that we have to move the hazard-centric to the human-centric. That's certainly is true, and we have to work together as a scientists to take this acknowledge of science to the governments and also to society to make more clear these connections between these three agents. That's more or less what I can see from the paper presented by Dr. Kaori, and also what this represents nowadays in this context. Thanks, Triton.
Thank you very much for providing all of those insights onto the topic and the linkages between the three areas. You also raised questions around environmental justice and the differing impacts on different communities around the world. And also for raising that question of how do we educate institutions around making changes, which is really interesting that we might like to consider as we go along. What we will do now, thank you again to both of our speakers. We're going to open out now for debate. So please do either raise your hands or write it in the chat. As we're waiting for a couple of those to come in, I will kick off with a question, which can go to both of the speakers, really. And that's around this notion of climate change as a scapegoat, which I think is an important aspect to discuss. So it strikes me that if we're comparing the response to COVID with the response to climate change, we can see that while most of our governments we may consider to have been deficient in its response to COVID, at least there has been an urgency all around the world, and that's partly because of the immediacy and visibility of the impacts of a virus in comparison to the very long-term and not always visible impacts of climate change. So that led me to think that is it possible that the argument about climate change as a scapegoat might be dangerous in the sense of undermining a long-term task of actually raising the seriousness of this issue? And I ask it from the perspective for a piece of work that I've been thinking about for a while. I've read some of the climate change denial literature. Some of these people who argue either that there is no change in the climate, or it's not caused by greenhouse gases, or it's not going to be a big problem. There are different kinds of perspectives. But one of the key arguments that you find in that literature is that when you observe natural disasters of whatever form it might be, hurricanes, floods, and so forth, they're not caused by climate change. There's no link with climate change as a way of reducing the need to do something about greenhouse gases. So that's a very common argument in the climate change denial literature. And my question is there a danger that we might actually end up supporting those climate change denial positions by reducing the urgency and seriousness of the role of climate change in relation to those disasters. Any responses, Kauri or Tessy or both?
Would like to respond to that? I'm not sure, Tristan, if I understood your questions. You're saying that the negativist has a very strong argument saying that there is no climate change because the variability actually of the increase of the green gas emissions, it's natural. So we are just going through a wave that is increasing and then is going to come down. In fact, they are not totally wrong, because when you see the variability, looking at the paleoclimate data, you see that there are periods in our past that we have strong emissions, and then you go down, usually related to the glaciations, and then you go up again, and so on. What they fail to say is that what we are doing now is just changing the natural variability. We are putting, thanks to the industrialization, more CO2 in the atmosphere. So we are just changing the variability. And doing that, we are also changing the natural variability of our planet, of the climate of our planet. I think putting some emphasis, we have to carry on and say that climate change is really important, but it's linked to most of the other impacts, and also it's really strongly related to ourselves, to the society, how the society looks at the environment, and why the environment is important for the society. I think more or less in that direction.
Thank you very much, Tessy. Any comments, Kauri?
I'm not sure I quite understood your question, Tristan, but I don't think the scapegoat argument would undermine the significance of long-term climate change agenda. I think it's the other way around. Actually, it is to pinpoint the political motivation, to blame the political intention of not facing the social side of climate change. And so I think it's actually reinforcing it rather than undermining.
Excellent, thanks. So I'm now going to bring in one of our participants, Ilan Kelman, to make a comment and also a response on that same issue.
No, very kind. Thank you, Ilan Kelman, also at University College London, and thank you for this wonderful session and the excellent presentation and wonderful response. So very kind. On the issue of reporting science and what climate change does and does not do should never be supporting the skeptics. The skeptics are not scientific, we are. We know that hurricane disasters are not caused by climate change, no matter how much climate change affects hurricanes, because it comes from vulnerability. And that's why we avoid the phrase natural disaster, because disasters are not natural. Our job is to report the science, and which is climate change is happening, we are causing it, but the links to disasters are tenuous, and that's in the literature. Which sort of leads to my question, that all the policies mentioned are so important, including disaster risk reduction. Yet these policies existed and were supported long before human-caused climate change was known to be a concern. Do we really need to consider climate change mitigation and adaptation in order to promote and implement these important policies and actions? Thank you for your thoughts.
Thanks very much for that provocation. Any, do we really need climate change in that debate. Tercio Kaori.
Yes, we do. If you look at the human kind, they are moved to what's happening and then they react to that. It's always like that. So we always wait to happen a disaster, then to act to prevent that disaster that happened. I think climate change, the way we are using, in fact, we should use transition climate, because we haven't changed the climate yet. But we are still increasing the emissions in the atmosphere. We are still we don't know yet what's going the impact, what's going to be the impacts in the future. We have the models. The models give us some idea, but actually we don't know what's going to happen. But the thing is, we're still putting lots of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, and we are seeing that the climate we know, the variability we used to know are changing. So I think we do have to emphasize the importance of this climate transition and how it is impacting the humankind, taking lives, intensify the natural weather systems. I agree with Dr. Kelman. The cyclones and the hurricanes has been there since the beginning. But and this has been causing lots of death and disasters. Now we are most prepared for that because we do know how to forecast them with some advances, thanks to the science. But we also know that these systems are getting more stronger, more intense. Probably they are going to cause more deaths and disasters all along. So yes, we have to have have some thing to tell the governments to say, look, this is happening, and this is science that is saying. Because we look at the data, we understand the systems, and that we have to convey that information clearly to the government, to the stakeholders, to that people that can really take the action. So I think not scapegoats. Of course, some people use that for everything. As I said, everything that happens, it's because of climate change. And we, as a scientist, we know that that's not like that. We know that there is a natural variability. No, all the cold fronts or the cyclones or hurricanes are linked to the climate change. But the increase in the frequency and the impacts, this is probably relates to the global warming. So we have to have a balance that when we transfer our acknowledgement to the others.
Thank you very much. Kaori, did you have anything to add to that before we move on to the next question?
Yes, if I may. Yes, thank you for the provocative question, Ilan. I think we do need it as a science, particularly in the field of mitigation. Probably it has to be separated. But my puzzle at the moment is I'm not sure the difference between adaptation and reduction. That's something I would like to explore through research myself. That's the big question I have. I'm pretty confused about the clear difference. Maybe there isn't. So I myself don't have an answer to that question, Ilan, but I think we can't scrap altogether. We do need to have climate change science, but as a climate change adaptation part, I agree that I'm skeptical as well.
Thanks very much then. We'll move on now to Elaine Unterhalter, who's going to raise our next question.
Thanks, Tristan, and thanks, Kauri, Tertio, and Ilan. It's so interesting, all the issues you've raised. And Kauri, I really thank you for navigating through those policy declarations. It was really clear. So the question I raised in the chat is the question about inequalities. And I think Professor Tertio raised the issue that in disasters in cities, it's the people in the low income groups that suffer the most. But there are a range of intersecting inequalities that are not just about income that I think need to be woven into this discussion. And I want to kind of make it threefold in thinking about intersecting inequalities in relation to humans. And I think the current crisis we're in, which is now often described as in terms of a health crisis and a climate crisis and an economic crisis, probably also a political crisis and an education crisis. But there's the one kind of intersecting inequalities is these kind of descriptive inequalities, class, gender, race, that people often ethnicity, and those are often the most remarked upon, and those categories themselves come to be a sort of basket of vulnerabilities. But I think there's another kind of inequality, which is that the intersecting inequalities between institutions. So that in mitigation policies, it's usually the institutions linked with the economy or possibly housing that are the ones that are thought of most, or engineering, as Kauri was giving some examples, but the social forms of mitigation, and particularly almost the more invisible, the mental health, the psychosocial sides of education, there's an inequality in relation to institutions and organizations and the amount of money they get and their esteem in the society. And then the last kind of intersecting inequality is in the discursive inequalities. We almost don't have a language to talk about these complex vulnerabilities. And I think when we don't have a language to talk about them, they disappear. So if we're going to talk about educating institutions and connecting those three strands in the really illuminating way Kauri suggested, I think we've got to weave in the thread of addressing inequalities probably more cogently. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Opening up that issue of the human-centric nature of this and other forms of inequality beyond income and how we take those into account. Any responses at all to those points?
No, that is for Kaori.
Okay. Or we can come back to it in a little bit, Kauri.
Yes, please. This is a too big topic for me. I haven't reached that point yet. I'm afraid, Elaine. I'm really sorry. Let me have a little think.
We might need a whole new
Yes.
phase of our research project to address that. Elaine, were you coming in there?
No, I was just saying, sorry to floor you with, a big thread, but I think it's, you're on the right track, but we just need to weave this thread through because it's so evident, but it's not talked about enough.
Thanks, Elaine, and I hope we'll be able to pick it up again in some of the discussions that follow, but thank you for raising those issues. We'll pass now to Charlie Nasi, who will pose the next question.
Hi, thanks Tristan, and thanks Carrie and Tercio for such an interesting discussion, and for the attendees for raising such interesting questions. Mine, I guess, builds on the two that have gone so far and asks whether the issue is climate change itself or a particular understanding of climate change that doesn't recognise the anthropogenic nature of climate change. And if we start to think about climate change in a more nuanced way, which relates both to that kind of human-centric perspective, but also the way that climate change both magnifies and is caused by those deep-seated inequalities that Elaine is talking about, whether that gets us somewhere further. Because I kind of instinctively am quite resistant about the idea of rejecting the language of climate change, or of not saying that it's one of the most important things that faces us. Although I understand, you know, for example, if you have a tsunami, labeling that as climate change is just a way of kind of escaping the kind of vulnerability lens. But I'm just thinking, is there a way to bring climate change in that kind of recognizes it in a much fuller and more nuanced way that gets us out of the problem?
Thanks, Charlie, and that's really helpful in taking forward some of the discussions that we had earlier on. Who would like to respond to that?
I don't have an answer again. I think that's the answer we are all looking for, I suppose. Yes, it's climate change is too emphasized too much. That's one thing, but I totally agree with you, Charlie, that I don't agree with getting rid of it. So how do we balance, and how do we do the weaving that Elaine's referred to? I'm afraid I don't have an answer to that. It's the question that I hope to think with you. Yeah. Maybe audience, anybody from the audience has.
Yeah, please. If anyone in the audience would also like to comment, just raise a hand. Tercio.
Yeah, no, I always say that sometimes people makes a confusion between environmental change and climate change. And environmental change is quite nice it's easy to explain. So you use, for instance, the mangroves example that Dr. Kaori gave is quite clear. If you change the environmental in a local environment, indirectly we are going to change the climate in that region, and the sum of all these changes makes the change in the climate as a global. So what's happening in the big cities is just like that. People are going towards the cities. So nowadays you have more people live in the cities than in the rural areas. And the cities are becoming hotspots for the globe. And when you sum all these hotspots, you are also contributing to the climate change. So perhaps what we can do is exactly tell the society that if you are changing the environment, you are contributing to increase the warming in the atmosphere. And when you increase the warming in the atmosphere, you are exactly changing the climate, as you know. So I think it's not the case. Of course, when you change the environment, it's completely linked to the inequality and the difference in impacts in the most vulnerable people. This is quite important to take in action as well. So I think we have to actually to make more clear that climate change is related to many other actions, and the change in the environment that people can see when they see a polluted river, when they see the cities, there's no parks, no green areas in the cities, when they see that they are cutting the forest just to have more space for the cows and things like that. It's more easy to say that when you change that, you are going to change the climate. I think it's the way we communicate that is important. And not really now that climate change is a word and a meaning that everybody now, thanks to the media, is understanding more than before.
Thanks very much. I wonder if I can follow up with another question, which I suppose is perhaps devil's advocate, but I think it's an interesting one to tease out some of the points here, and that's around in connection as opposed to disconnection. And I think, you know, across all different areas of our lives and work and universities and different areas, you know, connection is in. You know, I mean, the sort of dirty words of our age are kind of silos, and, you know, working in silos is a bad thing, and you know, fragmentation, and I mean, and there's a lot of, you know, it evokes our sort of personal feelings about being together with others and the enjoyment of that affiliation, as opposed to being lonely and disconnected. So there are sort of poetic associations as well that we bring into our discussion of these things. And generally we want things to happen together and not to happen separately. But I'm wondering, have we perhaps got so much of a kind of an emotional resonance with this that maybe we miss some of the advantages of separation? Is it possible that having these three areas, if not completely separate, as distinct, might bring some advantages? It's a genuine question. I have no idea whether it will or not, but I thought I would at least open that up.
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. Because as Kaori has presented her paper, we have big institutions linked to each one of that. One is the the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. The other is the Framework Convention of the Climate, and also we have the other linked to the ODS. So actually, they've been working quite well in some ways. It's perhaps it's up to us as scientists to present the link between them, but not necessarily they have to be separate. They have to be linked together in a big institution. In some ways, the United Nations is the big institution that look at the different frameworks here. And I don't know. I think it's a fair point you just put.
Oh, Kaori, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it is an interesting question. And yeah, it is already, that's been the case. This is disconnected. Has been the case. And probably those who have benefited are the probably those officials in the United Nations and all those policymakers, seniors, and but this is probably where Elaine's point comes in. I think changing the whole structure wouldn't be probably feasible. It's not realistic, and but something has to kind of horizontally develop. Maybe this structure, you know, can't be, you know, refurbished completely, but you know, something new has to happen, like what we are experiencing in our society as well. I think something to make changes, structural changes, so time-consuming and it's too challenging, and some kind of new idea that enables connectedness while allowing certain level of disconnectedness, which is probably inevitable in the current world.
Thank you. We'll move on to Elaine. Elaine, are you going to contribute to this point, or is it a new question?
No, it's actually on this point. And in fact, it's sort of saying the same thing that Kaori was saying, but in a way that comes out of maybe two, maybe three experiences of mine. So the kind of headline point is that instead of disconnection, maybe you should think about the point of articulation. So articulation also in English has got two meanings. It means like to connect the way that two bones articulate and they are in relationship with each other. And it also means to say, to have, so to have a new language. And so maybe there needs to be some kind of consider, not just of joined upness, but articulation, that you kind of consider the historical differences that Kaori was mapping, but you also consider how they connect. And I don't think the SDGs, because they gave each goal to different UN organizations, and the UN process sort of brings them all together in a lump, but I don't think it really looks at articulation in quite that way. And the two experiences that might be interesting comparatively, I think, is first, I think the decade of education for sustainable development was quite weak because it didn't really connect with the education for all movements, and they had different dynamics going on. The other example is from gender mainstreaming, where the kind of vision articulated in the Beijing Platform for Action was that gender would be mainstreamed through all organizations, which didn't really work. It turned it into a very technical process, seemed to detach it from the social movements that had given rise to demands for women's rights and gender equality. But it seems to me it's not either or. You both have to have gender mainstreaming, or you have to have the kind of human vulnerability mainstreaming that you're advocating. But you also need possibly some separate spaces where these things are discussed by different communities of practice. I hope that's helpful.
Extremely helpful. Thanks, Elaine. I really like that idea of the two different forms of articulation. Let's bring in Charlie now, because I think that's her comment is on the same point as well.
Yes, thank you, Tristan. And I think mine echoes Elaine. So we've been thinking about this a lot in the project, and the questions that Carrie was raising about the implications for education. And I guess what I would advocate for is education as a space of articulation. And my concern with this kind of idea of disconnect is the way that it kind of can give weight to or kind of get caught up in the kind of very right wing or kind of nationalist close downs of the way that, you know, in parallel to the COVID situation again, there were all of these sites of solidarity and this kind of language of all of the scientists working together on the vaccines and bringing all of those ideas together in a moment of crisis that then have really closed down in kind of where the vaccine gets sent and how much it costs and where it's provided to. And so I think with climate change, where there's the kind of global emissions picture, but then there's also the way that it happens within local contexts differently, I think that we really need to think about that meso level of connection in the way that Carrie was suggesting in terms of horizontality, and of whether education as individual institutions, but as a connected form of systems, helps us to kind of engage at that middle level of horizontal connections. So I guess I would reject kind of quite wholeheartedly the idea that we need to move towards disconnect, but we'll kind of endorse the view that we still need specialisms. We just need to bring those different things together. And one of the things I think that the climate science is really lacking is that relationship between the social scientists and the kind of hard scientists, the kind of more traditional climate scientists. And that's another space to kind of challenge how climate science is presented.
Thanks very much for those comments. And I'll bring in now Ilan Kelman for some further thoughts on this.
Okay, thank you. I mean, this is wonderful discussion and really, really helpful questions to try to understand where are we going. To understand where we should be going, we also need to know where we came from. And I think, Tristan, your comment was absolutely brilliant. Well, are there any advantages to the separation or the silos? And I think that where we have come from is about 40 years of deliberate separation, deliberate silos, deliberate creation of new vocabularies, to the point that words such as mitigation mean completely different actions in different fields, which is why Carrie confusion, her confusion is understandable. I mean, what is the difference between mitigation and risk reduction or stopping climate change? So where we have come from is actually creating these silos and the confusions to the point that basic science is obscured. So I would be delighted if we could have an advantage to the separation, particularly at the UN level, but I simply don't see it. And I see that we end up with territorialization. We end up with people protecting their resources and not wanting to cooperate, which simply hurts us all and disadvantages us all. So even to the extent that we hear frequently that hurricanes and other tropical cyclones are increasing in frequency due to climate change, but actually the observations and the modeling is that climate change is decreasing the frequency of hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones while increasing their intensities. And this has been the physical science consensus since major debates at the American Meteorological Society in 2005 and around that time. Even this year, with the absolutely incredible Atlantic and Caribbean hurricane season, which really had quite extensive numbers, as well as the wide range of the storms and their intensities. But when we look at the death tolls, they've declined. So a lot has been made of Eta and Iota slashing through Central America back to back. And people said this is climate change. And the politicians in Central America were saying this is climate change. But together, those two storms killed around 500 people. In 1974, in the same region, Hurricane Fifi killed more than 8,000 people. In 1998, Hurricane Mitch in the same region killed over 11,000 people. And in 2005, in the same region, Hurricane Stan killed over 1,500 people. So if we are going to attribute the 2020 hurricane season to climate change, then the wrong conclusion is that climate change is decreasing hurricane deaths. The reason why it's wrong is because hurricane deaths come from vulnerability. Hurricanes do not cause disasters, it's a vulnerability. And so this is where we need to stick to the basic science and be honest, open, and transparent about what the science says, which in no way diminishes climate change, in no way diminishes human responsibility for climate change, in no way diminishes our need to stop climate change and to deal with its impacts. But we do not want to give the skeptics ammunition by completely misreporting the science and by scapegoating climate change. Exactly as Carrie said, not scapegoating climate change gives us an advantage by supporting what human-caused climate change really does and the real reasons why we need to stop it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments and raised some really fascinating and crucial questions around science and communication of that to the general public and the complexities of doing that. Unless someone wants to come back immediately on those questions, Carrie or Terzi, did you have anything to add on that particular point before we move on?
Just that agree completely with Ian has just said. That's really the point in terms of using the climate change as a scapegoat. And also, I agree with Charlotte has said that we also need the social scientists to be involved. In fact, I am a member of the Science Steering Committee of the WCRP, World Climate Research Project. And we just have now 2 new members, and they are social scientists. So it's clear that we have to have these interactions between the hard scientists and also the social science. So very nice comments from both Charlotte and Ian. Thank you very much.
Just wanted to, endorse that completely. I cannot agree more. The importance of working together. Well, again, connected this collaboration, all these beautiful words that have been going around, but I think that is very important. I just wanted to reflect on Charlie's point about education, and education is also a scapegoat as well, in my view, because education is important, but it's very rarely discussed what kind of education. And education can be top-down, education can be really authoritarian, giving science information transmission. But to enable this horizontality and weaving, I think we need to be more creative. We, as social scientists, as Professor Tesio says, we need to be more creative in developing new ways of educating ourselves.
Thanks. Yes, and just picking up on Tesio's and Charlie's points about social sciences, a study I read recently, I think, estimated that less than 10% of climate change research funding goes to social sciences or arts and humanities, so a very small proportion. So that's something to think about. And Kaori's point is a nice segue about education. And I wonder whether we might say that education is sometimes seen as a panacea for these problems, but without a very nuanced understanding of the way that education operates and how, in fact, it might be utilized. And that brings me to what will probably be the final area of discussion. Now, this is a little bit unfair of me because Kaori's paper wasn't really about the role of the university, but the research project as a whole is about the role of the university. So I wonder if we could just for the last part of our discussion, just turn to that. And I wanted to pose the question, given this complexity of education and universities, which are education institutions, but they're also institutions of research and production of knowledge and science and so forth, as well as a variety of other kinds of functions. If we're thinking about this connection between the three areas, are universities part of the problem, or are they part of the solution? Are there aspects of the way universities function that are actually worsening this separation, or do they provide us with an important spur towards a connection? And what might we be doing better in that regard? So I'd invite both of our speakers, if you have any reflections on what the university is doing and what it could be doing better in this regard.
I can start. I think the university is the solution, actually. What we have to do is to teach the students, the undergraduate students, and eventually the graduate students, that's going to be really the voices outside of the university. These students may become a minister, may become a president in a country. They have positions that they can really take actions in favor of the environment. So the university has to even more give more information, present the state of the art of the science in terms of the climate change, the risk reduction, or everything like that. And I can say that, for instance, just saying a little bit about my university, the University of São Paulo, after Rio 92, that was what everything really starts to happen. My university took some actions in terms of residuals, in terms of water economy, energy, renewables, and so on. So it was just after that convention that the university starts to prepare itself. So along of the years, we are improving. I think nowadays we have courses linked to the environment. We have more knowledge about the climate change, the impacts, and so on. So the university has to be an example for the society, and we are responsible to prepare our students really to go outside and fight for us in terms of better acknowledgement and policymakers to prevent actually the changing of the climate, and also, of course, mitigating and adaptation of the climate.
Thanks. So yeah, the importance of the university as an education institution in forming those young people who come through in their general outlook, but also in their specific professional education. And also just to echo the points made there about the University of Sao Paulo, that internationally is a very interesting example of an institution that has gone a long way towards transforming itself. There are quite a few examples of small institutions that have been very innovative in relation to the natural environment. It's rather harder for the very large institutions to do so, because you've got a huge ship to change its direction. And University of Sao Paulo is one of those large institutions that's managing to do that very well. Kaori.
Thank you. Adding to what Professor Tercio said, yes, universities have a huge role, but I would see it from a slightly different angle of us being haves and us being elites, whether we like it or not. And we do have knowledges, we have opportunities to access knowledge and engage with this kind of very scientific discussions. But there are a lot of people have-nots, there are have-nots. And I think if university could think a little bit more about how to engage with those have-nots and share what we've got and expand. And I think at our university, UCL, we call it public engagement, but I think, and in our project too, we have this work package to engage with communities. But I think in many aspects of universities, if we could think of how can we share knowledge with a wider society, wider communities, in every topic, not just climate change, but in various kinds of knowledge, that would be, I think, really, really wonderful.
Thanks, Kaori. Yes, the public engagement aspect of universities is one of the least studied aspects of its role. In fact, there are not nearly enough studies looking at this, and particularly important given the points raised by Ilan Kelman around the need to be honest about the science and the great subtleties that are needed in terms of the ways that we communicate these things. If there aren't any other burning questions from the floor, I think we will move towards drawing our discussion to a close. It's been an incredibly rich debate, raising some thorny but absolutely crucial questions around the different conceptual areas, academic fields, but also practical areas, and drawing in the politics of knowledge production and climate action, disaster and sustainable development as well. So I will finish by just inviting Kaori and Tercio to make any final comments that they would like before we finish.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank you to everyone who's here today, and for those who gave me feedback on the paper. And I just wanted to say again that this paper was really inspired by Professor Ilan Kelman's original paper. And it really convinced me, but at the same time, today's discussion made me realize actually there are a lot more to think about. And more bigger questions that I need to take into consideration. So it's been a great opportunity, and thank you, Professor Tercio, for your excellent, helpful response. Thank you.
Thank you again. Thank you, Dr. Kaori, for the nice presentation, the paper. I learned quite a lot. I had some ideas in different stages, and you put together these ideas, and the discussion about the importance of these three frameworks was quite illuminating. Thank you, Tristan, for this opportunity to be here and to listen to these questions and to be part of the discussion. I think we have lots of things to do as a scientist. Again, I think the social sciences and the hard sciences have to be together, because we see that, as Dr. Kelman has said, vulnerabilities is not linked to the system itself, but it's the way people are living in risk areas, for instance, when you have a hurricane. So these discussions we have to put forwards for the society and to the governments. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me, and it's very nice to be here. To know Dr. Kaori was a pleasure. Thank you very much, Tristan.
Well, thank you so much to Kaori and to Tercio for your inputs, and to everyone else. And one of the difficult things about our new world is that we don't have a sort of an audible applause after talks, which I always I miss that. But anyway, let's imagine that we can hear the applause ringing out for those fantastic inputs that people have had, that people have given, and for all of you for attending as well and contributing. This is a forum for the more theoretical discussions. The project also is going to be grappling with these issues in the day-to-day lives of universities in different parts of the world. And some of these similar issues are going to come up, and we hope also to be able to report on how things are going in our participating universities in the course of this project. The next webinar that we will hold in this series will in fact be on participatory action research, and that's going to be the core of our approach within these universities for developing this work. We don't have a date for that yet, but we will let you all know when that will be, and we very much look forward to joining us there. If you haven't done so already, you can get Kaori's working paper on the website. Please do get in contact with us if you would like to be involved more in the project in any way, either in terms of these debates that we're having, some of the theoretical work, or also in a more practical sense, if you would like your university to be engaged in some of the interventions that we're developing. We'd be absolutely delighted to hear from you. So thanks again, everyone, and to Kaori and Tercio, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all.
Thank you.